Hi, everybody. Joe Cioffi here. Weather in 5 days in 5 minutes on this Wednesday, the 4th of September. Coming up tonight on the Joe and Joe Weather Show podcast. The weather across the United States continues with the nice weather in the east, the hot weather in the west, the rains along the immediate Gulf Coast, and the quiet tropics. That's all coming up tonight on the Joe and Joe Weather Show podcast at 7:35 p.m. Eastern Time. In the meantime, watches and warnings are pretty much non-existent in the east. We do have flood watches along the coastal bend of Texas as well as southern Louisiana, as heavy rains will persist there along the Gulf Coast and back to the west coast of Florida. In the west, we've got excessive heat and heat advisories from western and southern Arizona to southern California and then northward up into Oregon and Washington State. But rest of the nation really kind of enjoying some quiet September weather as September usually is for the most part a quiet month unless there are tropical storms or hurricanes running around, and we don't have that. On the satellite loop this morning, you can see overnight some lightning strikes that going on along coastal Texas as well as just offshore of the Florida Panhandle. We'll probably see some more showers and storms develop there today. From Maine down to Georgia, skies are for the most part clear. Some of that Gulf moisture is streaming some high clouds across Tennessee and Kentucky into parts of Virginia and North Carolina. That's not going to be a big deal. And we are probably going to see a little bit of activity as far as thunderstorms and severe weather in the northern plains, extending back into Montana and Wyoming later today. And that's where you see the shower activity this morning on the radar from Utah northeast into the Dakotas. We've got that rain and downpours and some heavier thunderstorms along the Texas Gulf Coast and just offshore the Florida coast. Again, this will probably push inland later on this morning and this afternoon. Rain extending into parts of Arkansas, and then it dries out as it moves into Kentucky and Tennessee, thanks to that big high in the Northeast. And speaking of the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic states and the Southeast, the radars there quiet. The Storm Prediction Center today, we are looking at a marginal risk for severe weather from Wyoming and northern Colorado into southeastern Montana, northeastward into Minnesota. The tornado risk is not elevated. It's less than 2%. And then no severe weather is expected tomorrow, just some general thunderstorm activity from the Great Lakes down to Texas, east to Florida, and perhaps along the coast of the Carolinas into southeastern Virginia. And as we move on to day three, we see, so again, general thunderstorms along the Gulf Coast and the southeast coast of Florida, also in parts of the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes, and that extends back into New Mexico and Arizona. This is going to be with the next cold front that is going to be the issue for part of the weekend. And as far as rainfall is concerned, again, on the immediate coast where we've got the flood watches, we're looking at 5 or more inches over the next 7 days along the coastal bend of Texas, southern Louisiana. A little bit less for the Florida Panhandle, but still at least several inches, even down into parts of central Florida. Then it tails off a bit in South Florida. In the Northeast, we're looking at a half to 3/4 of an inch with that next front, still seeing indications of some heavier rains in parts of Ontario province and into Quebec province in Canada, a little bit less up in Maine, and the rest of the country we're talking about for the most part 1/4 of an inch or less. So it's all about high pressure because we've got a ton of high pressure here that is um, today moving off the mid-Atlantic, off the northeast coast. The high goes to Cape Cod. So we do have a bit of an onshore flow that sets up from Virginia southward into the southeast. There's a wave on the old cold front that's going to head out underneath us. And you can see the Gulf moisture with lower pressures there. But conditions for tropical cyclone development are just not there. We've got the strong winds aloft that are preventing tropical systems from developing, at least the ones that are closer to the U.S., the Gulf of Mexico, the southeast coast. Meanwhile, high pressure holds on for Thursday and probably for Friday. The flow will be a little bit more onshore as we go into Friday, so maybe we'll start to deal with a little bit of cloud cover that moves in the nighttime and morning hours. But on the whole, there's so much dry air It's going to take a while for that moisture to penetrate. You can see the rains along the Gulf Coast into Alabama and Georgia on Friday, and a low that develops offshore and heads towards Nova Scotia on Friday. And then also we've got this cold front that's coming for Friday night and Saturday. So all these systems together would cause a big problem. They seem to want to stay as separate entities, and that's good. I'm thinking that we'll have showery rains for Saturday, maybe an odd thunderstorm or two in the mix late Saturday into Saturday night. And then it looks like that front's going to keep on moving. So we'll see improving weather conditions on Sunday. And the first half of next week looks to be dry and nice across much of the Northeast and in the mid-Atlantic states. And speaking of the tropics, we have 3 weak disturbances out, 2 in the tropical Atlantic, another one that's going to be moving into the Northwest Caribbean and the Southwest Gulf of Mexico. None of these systems are indicated to become a tropical depression or a tropical storm anytime soon, if at all, as conditions generally across the Atlantic remain unfavorable for tropical cyclone development. And that, by the way, is a good thing. And we'll talk about that more tonight and look at all the latest model updates regarding the weather for the next 5 to 7 days. And that's on the Joe and Joe Weather Show podcast at 7:35 p.m. Eastern Time. So have a great Wednesday.